What's going on, everybody? It's TC, and in this video I'm going to go over some of my thoughts on mastering. Firstly, if you're new to the Wolfpack, a very warm welcome. If you're not, welcome back. And if you find any of the information in this video useful, please smash that like button, smash! And if you're not already part of the community, part of the Wolfpack, hit the subscribe button, click on the little bell to receive notifications every time I upload some fresh information. So this is my thoughts on mastering. So let's start off. What is mastering? Essentially, back in the day, it was transferring audio recordings from one medium to another. So it would be if a band had recorded onto tape, they'd mixed it down, and then they wanted to cut that to vinyl. The mastering engineer would be the guy that would take the tapes and record the lacquers, or record, I guess it would be dub plates. They would record the lacquers for pressing the vinyls. So back in the day, a mastering engineer's job was literally to transfer from one format to another. Nowadays, mastering has become a bit more of a dark art, like a science. And people expect a lot from mastering. And essentially what mastering is just a little tweak here and there to bring the song to the right balance so that it fits with all the other songs, either on an album or to sound like you as an artist. Having a good relationship with your mastering engineer is definitely important because they're the ones that are going to give you that finality on a track. So nowadays, a lot of people are mastering their own tracks, and that's totally fine. I'm quite happy to master my own tracks. I've spent time with mastering engineers. I've spoken to mastering engineers. I've done a lot of research on mastering. So I kind of understand quite a lot of the things that a mastering engineer is going to do to finalize a track for you. So essentially it's going to be an EQ, a compressor, and something to bring the loudness up on the very final of a mastering chain. So what you want to achieve with the EQ is obtaining the correct balance of the track. So the top end, the bottom end, and the mid-range. And really, you should have a good balance when you're bouncing it out of your DAW or of your digital audio workstation. So the track should sound very much like it's going to sound pre-mastering. So with EQ, let's break this down. So you've got your EQ, you've got your compression, and you've got your limiter or clipping. A lot of mastering engineers use clipping instead of a limiter because it's a much cleaner way sometimes of achieving the loudness that you want without artifacts of a pumping sound to your track. A lot of limiters and compressors, they react and they create like a kind of a squashy sound. So personally, I like sort of very clean, punchy, crisp sound to my tracks. So I'm more on the side of the clipping side of things than the limiter kind of side of things. So we'll start off with EQ. So essentially with EQ, you could view it as if it had three bands almost. There'd be the top end, the mid-range, and the bass. With bass, it's quite important to, it's hard to explain this stuff, so you have to bear with me, but with the low end, it can really be about a high pass filter from around 30 hertz with a 12 dB curve. I know this might sound like gibberish if you're just starting out, but if you've had a little bit of experience, you will understand what I'm talking about. That's a very light curve on a high pass filter. But what it will do is it will remove any DC offset to start off with, and it will allow that song to work on a lot more different speaker systems. There are lots of different types of speaker systems. There's bass reflex, which means they're speakers which have like holes in them, which will like fire bass at you. There's enclosed cab speaker systems. And understanding all of these different kinds of speaker systems allows you to make the right decisions when it comes to mastering. Obviously, you want to have the right levels of bass to top end, but that high pass on the bass can really just kind of lift the whole track up, make it so that it's more better. So I don't really know how to explain it, but that is one of the tricks. It's a slight high pass. Obviously, you want to make sure that your bass is reaching the right levels. And in your mix down stage, you should make sure that the sub bass really does have the right level in comparison with the kick, and making sure that it's uniform across the different bass sounds that you're using. Otherwise, the mastering engineer or someone like me might have to level that bass with a multi-band compressor. So you don't really want like peaks of sub bass shooting out there and messing up the balance of the track, because as you go into the different stages in the mastering. When you hit the clipping stage, if there's a lot of high energy bass, then that is going to make the clipping sound distorted. So one of the things that I learned back in day was that the more sub bass you have is actually going to make your track quieter. So that's a real balance, especially in bass music, to how much bass you're going to have. And a lot of these balances come from old formats. So we're going back to the mastering engineer being the guy who changes from one format to another. With tape and with vinyl, there's definite limits to the amount of top end you can cut to vinyl and the amount of bass that you can cut to vinyl, because when the cutting head is cutting through the grooves on the vinyl, there's only so much space in bass energy that it can cut. And also with the top end, there's heat issues when it comes to the lathe getting really hot because of the top end. And the Stanton cart width, the actual width of the needle on a vinyl record is the size of a 16K wavelength, or smaller than a 16K. I think it's like 11 or 12K. So the physical size of the needle is smaller than the wavelength that's coming out at you through your speakers. So you can't actually physically cut that much top end on there. And that's why vinyl is said to be warm, because you can't physically cut as much top end onto vinyl. A lot of our mastering engineers will have big rooms with like £100,000 speakers and lots of very expensive equipment. And that's how they get their balance. They learn their room. So they know how much top end should be coming out of their speakers, how much bass should be coming out of the speakers, and how much mid-range should be coming out of the speakers. And they kind of tweak and tune it, and they do most of it with their ears. Whenever I've gone to proper mastering studios, they always usually have a spectrum analyzer, because you can't always trust your ears. There's changes in atmospheric pressure. One day your ears might not be as responsive as another day. You know, things change with your ears. So using a spectrum analyzer and learning the spectrum analyzer from a mastering standpoint, I feel is very important. What I do is I have a spectrum analyzer running all the time. So whenever I'm listening to other people's music, if I'm listening to anything, even if it's YouTube videos, the spectrum analyzer's on and I'm just looking at it in the background. And let's say someone sends me a tune, I'll have a look at it on the spectrum and be like, oh, their bass is hitting here and their top end is hitting there. And I just kind of make a mental note. And after 5 or 10 years of learning your spectrum analyzer, learning your speakers, you get a really good idea as to what tunes should be hitting. But it's always, subjective. Sometimes with more transient sounds, they're going to like peak up on the spectrum and look like they've got a lot of top end, when in fact they really don't. So like that's where you have to learn the sort of dynamic element of music, and learning your speakers and learning your spectrum analyzer, listening to hundreds of tunes on those speakers and watching at the same time will give you a fantastic idea about how tunes should be balanced. And really it is about balance, because when you add one thing, you're going to have to take away another. Because if you add with an EQ, then the whole volume is going to have to come down slightly to rebalance. So learning the balance is really a thing. I know that a lot of mastering engineers will be thinking about loudness, and loudness is really a combination of balance and also clipping. If you think about it like this, with EQ, mid-range is so important in tunes. I think a lot of people lose sight of how important mid-range really is. Mid-range is the difference between if I come and talk to you and I say like, hi, that's a lot of like top end and a lot of like low end. But if I go like, hi, then you're hearing a lot more mid-range and it's a lot more present. And it's like the difference between like a trombone sound or like a bass guitar sound. There's a lot of energy in that mid-range. Your ears, so we're thinking about ears. Your ears are really the final part of the chain in the mastering chain. So your ears actually have an EQ to them. Throughout history, as we were evolving, your ears were designed to peak in the mid-range because babies cry at 3.5 kilohertz. And you want to be able to hear that so that you can save your baby when it's crying. So, and your children also have a peak in when they're crying or shouting or whatever, your ears are very sensitive to that 3.5K. The mastering chain really doesn't stop once the mastering engineer is finished, and he has to consider that it's going to continue through either the iPod headphones you're going to listen to the material on, or like a club system. If it's a club tune, it's going to come out of a Pioneer CDJ into a mixer and then down into a digital desk, and then probably through a terrible compressor and a crossover network into some amps, into some speakers, and then finally into your ears. The mono compatibility comes into this as well at that point, because you might be standing next to one speaker in a club and you're not going to hear it in stereo. It's very rare that you're going to be sat between two speakers perfectly. So that has to be considered as well. And so you have to make sure that things work in mono. So the whole balance of the song is basically what I'm trying to get across, is that balance is super, super important. There's also another element, which is like the dark arts. And I'm not going to say that I really understand this to a massive degree, but it's the stereo spread of a track. So a track can be split mid-side between the mono and the stereo information. And a lot of mastering engineers will be EQing the mono and the stereo separately and then recombining them together. With vinyl cutting, it's almost... Well, it's impossible to cut stereo information below 300 hertz. So they'll split the mono and the stereo and they'll high pass the stereo side of it from around 300 hertz. The reason why you can't cut stereo below 300 hertz to vinyl is because it'll make the needle skip out of the track. It's called antiphase. So mono and stereo is... it's a bit of dark arts. I think a lot of mastering engineers would add more stereo information to sort of make it sound bigger. I'm not really that guy. I feel like, and some actually I think will make it smaller so that it will be less, depending on the amount that's in there, because for every 3 dB on the sides, apparently you're losing 3 dB in the middle. You're losing a lot of the power in the tune. And I think a lot of them change the stereo width depending on the part of the track that you're in as well, which is, I don't know about that kind of stuff. But I also know that some mastering engineers, they will take the drop of a song and they'll just turn it up at the beginning of their chain by 1 decibel so that it has a 1 dB lift on the drop. So it gives you that kind of like punch of, whoa, that is really dropped. And it just gives it that kind of like little extra. So it's all these little like tweaks and changes and like, it's very, very like tweaky. But those little changes can make a massive difference. So I've spoken a little bit about EQ. There's a compression side of it, which again, I feel like compression is just glue. And basically what it's going to be doing is making the quieter parts louder and the louder parts come into line with the quieter parts. So that compression side of thing, I don't feel is that important personally. I think just touching a compressor and literally just the tiniest amount can be really effective at just adding a kind of a glue to the song. And also if you're doing that, adding that 1 dB on the drop, it drives into the compressor a little harder just on the drop. And that can give it a very nice sort of like, if it's a very nice compressor, if it's a very expensive either plug-in or piece of hardware, it will add more flavor the more you drive into that compression. And it will sound like, this sounds good. Obviously, it depends on the source material, but that driving into a compressor can be a nice sound. And then finally, there's the loudness side of things, which I use clipping. So I've got several different types of plugins that will perform clipping. In the mastering studios that I've been into, they use a hardware setup to get this clipping thing. So they will be playing your tune through a mastering desk with very expensive EQs, some like mid-side sort of like dark art stuff, just like all sorts of like wondrous, crazy expensive equipment. And then when it goes back into the computer, when they're recording it back in, they'll use incredibly expensive A to D converters and they will clip into those converters. And if those converters are really good, they'll be able to handle that clipping and give you the loudness that you want without any artifacts. I don't have any of that equipment, so I just use plugins to achieve the same thing. There are some really good plugins out there now that can achieve a very similar amount of loudness. So, and K-Clip is one of those. That is awesome. Definitely worth checking out. And finally, there's a sort of a flavor element. and that could be maybe a hardware like preamp with some transformers in there. That might give you the sound of, I always say, like the sound of the universe, but there's sort of like a real flavor element to mastering, which can really just add that. It's like the final 4% or 2%. Really, mastering it's not a big deal, but it's very important to have your tracks so that they fit in with everything else and they're going to sound good in the mix. Primarily this is a drum and bass thing, so obviously if your tune doesn't really fit in with the other tunes, then DJ's going to be like, this doesn't really sound right. So mastering really is just a small part of the whole process, but a very important part at that. This has just been like ramblings, really. I'm happy to do another video on this that explains it in more depth with more detail, but I just thought I'd have a talk about the things that I feel are really important in mastering. So if you found anything in this video interesting, please don't forget to hit that like button and really smash the subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Thanks so much for watching, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you have any ideas for future videos, I read all the comments, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.